By 1966, the Beatles were no longer content with simply being the biggest pop group on Earth. Beatlemania had already conquered the world years earlier, but fame alone was beginning to feel limiting. Inside the studio, the band had started chasing something far more dangerous: reinvention. Every new session became an experiment. Every recording pushed further away from the safe formulas that had made them icons. The cheerful harmonies and innocent love songs of their early years were slowly dissolving into strange textures, abstract ideas, and psychedelic ambition. And standing quietly at the center of that transformation was producer George Martin, the man often described as the fifth Beatle. Without Martin, many of the group's wildest ideas might never have survived the studio. But during the creation of Revolver, even Paul McCartney briefly wondered whether they had finally gone too far. The song causing that anxiety was "Tomorrow Never Knows." At that point, the Beatles were evolving faster than almost anyone around them. Albums like Rubber Soul had already hinted at deeper artistic ambitions, blending folk influences, introspective songwriting, and experimental recording techniques into mainstream pop music. Around them, the entire British rock scene was beginning to change as well. Bands were becoming louder, stranger, and more adventurous. Psychedelia was creeping into popular culture, and musicians everywhere seemed to be determined to break every rule that had previously defined rock and roll. The Beatles, naturally, wanted to go even further. Songs like Paperback Writer had already introduced heavier guitar textures and more experimental studio layering, but Tomorrow Never Knows felt like something entirely different. It barely resembled a traditional pop song at all. Instead of moving through elegant chord changes, the track revolved around a hypnotic drone inspired heavily by Indian classical music. Above that pulsing foundation floated distorted tape loops, manipulated sounds, backwards recordings, and one of the strangest vocal performances ever heard on a Beatles record. The song sounded less like four musicians performing together and more like a transmission arriving from another dimension. Even by the Beatles' standards, it felt radical. McCartney later admitted that he genuinely worried about how George Martin would react when he first heard the idea. After all, Martin came from a polished classical background. He understood orchestration, structure, and sophisticated arrangements. Tomorrow Never Knows, on the other hand, sounded like controlled chaos. Recalling the moment years later, McCartney explained, "We thought it was all right because Indian music is all on one chord. I was a bit worried how he was going to take it." It was a revealing fear. By then, the Beatles trusted Martin deeply, but they also understood just how unconventional the material had become. Up to that point, even their most experimental songs still retained traces of familiar pop craftsmanship. Tomorrow Never Knows stripped much of that away. There was no sentimental melody to soften the edges, no obvious commercial hook, just atmosphere, rhythm, and pure psychedelic immersion. Much of the vision came from John Lennon, who had become increasingly fascinated by Eastern philosophy, altered consciousness, and the expanding possibilities of the recording studio itself. Influenced by psychedelic experiences and texts like The Psychedelic Experience by Timothy Leary, Lennon wanted the song to feel transcendent, almost spiritual. And his requests inside the studio were famously bizarre. At one stage, Lennon reportedly told Martin he wanted his voice to sound like thousands of monks chanting from a mountaintop. For most producers in the mid-1960s, that request would have sounded impossible or ridiculous. George Martin never dismissed it. That was his genius. Rather than pulling the Beatles back towards safer territory, Martin instinctively tried to understand what they were hearing in their heads. He may not have always fully grasped the psychedelic philosophy driving the band, but he recognized creativity when he saw it. More importantly, he understood how to translate impossible artistic ideas into actual recordings. Inside EMI Studios, alongside engineer Jeff Emmerich, Martin helped construct the surreal sonic landscape that made Tomorrow Never Knows revolutionary. tape loops spun simultaneously across different machines. Sounds were sped up, reversed, and manipulated beyond recognition. Lennon's vocals were pushed through rotating Leslie speakers to create an eerie, dreamlike effect. Even Ringo Starr delivered one of the most hypnotic drumming performances of his career, anchoring the entire experiment with mechanical precision. The studio itself had become an instrument. That concept now feels normal in modern music production, but before albums like Rubber Soul, studios were largely designed to document performances. The Beatles began treating the studio as a creative playground where songs could be dismantled, reshaped, and rebuilt into something impossible to reproduce live. Tomorrow Never Knows became the clearest symbol of that transformation. The song didn't simply push the Beatles into psychedelia, it helped push popular music into an entirely new era. Its influence would eventually echo through psychedelic rock, electronic music, ambient music, sampling culture, and countless experimental production techniques that became standard decades later. What makes the story remarkable is that even the people creating it weren't entirely sure it would work. McCartney genuinely thought George Martin would hate it. Instead, Martin embraced the challenge almost immediately. He understood that the Beatles were no longer trying to write conventional pop songs. They were trying to expand the boundaries of what recorded music could become. That trust changed everything. Without George Martin's willingness to follow the band into uncharted territory, songs like Eleanor Rigby, Strawberry Fields Forever, and A Day in the Life might never have reached their full artistic potential. He became the bridge between the Beatles' imagination and reality, the figure capable of turning abstract visions into timeless recordings. Nearly 60 years later, Tomorrow Never Knows still feels startlingly modern. Its textures remain unsettling, its production still sounds futuristic, and its ambition continues to overshadow countless records that came after it. That alone says everything about how far ahead of its time the song truly was. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story is this. When the Beatles first brought the idea into the studio, they weren't entirely confident themselves. Beneath all the experimentation and artistic fearlessness, there was still uncertainty lingering in the room. McCartney genuinely thought George Martin would hate it. Instead, together they created one of the most revolutionary recordings in music history.